Step back in time with me, to a London shrouded in fog and fear. Long before a name like Jack the Ripper was ever whispered in its dark alleys, we're going to explore the world that created a monster. The London of the late 1880s, specifically the district of Whitechapel. This isn't just a story about a killer. It's the story of a city on the edge, a place of stark contrasts and crushing poverty that set the stage for one of history's most infamous crime sprees. To understand the Autumn of Terror, you first have to understand Whitechapel. Forget the London you see in postcards, with its grand palaces and manicured parks. Whitechapel, in the East End, was a world away from all that. It was the dark, pulsating heart of industrial London, a labyrinth of narrow, gaslit streets, overcrowded tenements, and shadowy courtyards. The air itself was thick with the smell of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, tanneries, and the nearby River Thames, which was more of an open sewer than a river. This was the capital of a global empire, the richest city on earth. Yet for a vast number of its inhabitants, life was a desperate, daily struggle for survival. The Industrial Revolution had pulled hundreds of thousands of people from the countryside and from across Europe into the city, all searching for work. But there wasn't enough work to go around, and what was available was often dangerous and poorly paid. Dock workers, for instance, would line up every morning, hoping to be picked for a day's labor, a system known as the Kala. It was a lottery of desperation. If you weren't chosen, you didn't eat. This chronic poverty created the defining feature of Whitechapel, the slums. Families of 10 or more would cram into a single, squalid room, often without running water or sanitation. Buildings were decrepit, literally rotting from the inside out. Disease was rampant. Typhoid, cholera, and tuberculosis tore through the population, particularly affecting the young and the weak. Infant mortality was staggeringly high. Life was cheap, and death was a constant, familiar neighbor. Into this melting pot of misery flowed wave after wave of immigrants. Irish families fleeing the famine, and a large number of Eastern European Jews, particularly from Russia and Poland, escaping pogroms and persecution. While they brought a rich cultural vibrancy to the area, they also increased the competition for scarce jobs and housing, which sometimes led to tension and resentment from the existing population. Whitechapel became one of the most densely populated and diverse square miles on the planet. Where there is such intense poverty, crime inevitably follows. The streets of Whitechapel were prowled by pickpockets, muggers, and gangs. The police, the Metropolitan Police Force, were stretched incredibly thin. An officer patrolling his beat was often isolated, armed with only a wooden truncheon and a whistle to call for backup that might be minutes away. They were often viewed with suspicion and hostility by the local community, seen less as protectors and more as enforcers for the wealthy establishment. Alcohol was the primary escape from this grim reality. The area was saturated with pubs and gin palaces, offering a fleeting moment of warmth and oblivion. For many, a penny for a glass of gin was a more pressing need than a penny for a piece of bread. This widespread alcoholism fueled violence, domestic abuse, and despair, trapping people in a vicious cycle. And at the very bottom of this social ladder were the estimated 1,200 prostitutes working within Whitechapel alone. These weren't women of choice, but women of necessity. A widow, an abandoned wife, or a factory worker who lost her job had few options. Selling her body was often the only thing that stood between her and starvation. They walked the streets at night, vulnerable and exposed, their lives dictated by the few pennies they could earn to pay for a bed in one of the common lodging houses. These lodging houses, or dose houses, were a key feature of the Whitechapel landscape. For a few pence, you could get a spot on a lice-infested mattress in a dormitory packed with strangers, or even just the right to lean against a rope stretched across a room to sleep on your feet. There was no privacy, no security. These were the places the future victims of the Ripper would call home, moving from one to the next, night after night. This was the environment the overcrowded, unsanitary, and dangerous world of Whitechapel in 1888. It was a community living on a knife's edge, ignored by the polite society of West London. The press and the authorities were largely uninterested in the daily tragedies of the East End. The death of a poor woman was barely a statistic. It was a perfect hunting ground, a place where a person could disappear without a trace, where screams could be mistaken for a drunken brawl, and where a killer could melt back into the shadows of the maze-like streets, unnoticed. The stage was set. The fog was rolling in off the Thames. The year was 1888, and the autumn of terror was about to begin. The world was about to learn the name of Whitechapel, not for its poverty or its people, but for the brutal acts of a phantom who would turn its dark streets into his personal theater of death. In the autumn of 1888, a shadow fell over the gaslit streets of London's East End. A series of brutal murders plunged the district of Whitechapel into a state of terror, creating a mystery that has endured for over a century. The killer was known only by his infamous moniker, Jack the Ripper. But this is not his story. This is the story of the women whose lives he stole. Today, we're going back to Victorian London to respectfully remember the canonical five, the women whose deaths are definitively attributed to the Ripper. We'll examine the facts, the crime scenes, and the lives they lived before they were tragically cut short. Our story begins on August 31st, 1888. The first victim was Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly. She was 43 years old, a mother of 5 who had fallen on hard times after her marriage ended. Like many women in Whitechapel, she was struggling with poverty and alcoholism, often sleeping in common lodging houses. In the early hours of that Friday morning, Polly's body was discovered in Bucks Row, a dark and narrow street. She had been seen alive just an hour earlier, trying to get money for a bed. When her body was found by a cart driver named Charles Cross, it was initially believed she was simply drunk and unconscious. But the terrible truth was soon revealed by the first police officer on the scene, who discovered her throat had been cut twice. The subsequent medical examination uncovered even more horrific injuries to her abdomen. The press frenzy began, but the true reign of terror had only just started. The killer was methodical, swift, and had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a community gripped by fear. Just 8 days later, on September 8th, the killer struck again. This time, the victim was 47-year-old Annie Chapman. Annie was known as Dark Annie due to her dark hair. She was also separated from her husband and had lost a child, which sent her into a spiral of depression and heavy drinking. On the morning of her death, she was short of the money needed for her bed at a lodging house. She told a friend she would try to find the money on the street. Her body was found around 6 a.m. in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. The scene was even more gruesome than the last. Like Polly Nichols, her throat was cut, but this time the killer had gone further, mutilating her body with a terrifying degree of surgical precision. Her intestines had been removed and placed over her shoulder, and a portion of her uterus had been taken from the scene. The police now knew they were dealing with someone who was not just a murderer, but a hunter who was escalating in his brutality. The idea of a medically skilled killer began to take hold, adding a new layer of dread to the investigation. The killer's audacity reached a terrifying peak on the night of September 30th, a date that would become known as the double event. In a single night, he claimed 2 victims within an hour of each other. The first was Elizabeth Stride, a 44-year-old Swedish immigrant. Liz Stride was well known and generally well liked in the area. She had a tumultuous life, moving to London and marrying. But she too had fallen into the familiar pattern of poverty and lodging house life. Her body was discovered at about 1 a.m. in Dutfield's yard, off Berner Street. A steward of a nearby club, Louis Diemschutz, entered the yard with his pony and cart. The pony shied away, and in the darkness, Diemschutz discovered what he thought was a bundle on the ground. It was Elizabeth. Her throat had been cut, but unlike the previous victims, she had no other mutilations. The medical examiner believed the killer had been interrupted, likely by Diemschutz's arrival. It's believed that, frustrated in his bloodlust, not satisfied, the Ripper immediately went back out into the night, looking for another victim. Less than an hour later, and only a short walk away, he found Catherine Eddowes. Catherine was 46 years old and had been in police custody earlier that evening for being drunk and disorderly. She was released from Bishopsgate Police Station at 1 a.m., telling the desk sergeant she'd get a good hiding when she got home. Tragically, she never made it. At around 1:45 a.m., her horrifically mutilated body was found in Mitre Square, within the City of London. This was significant, as it brought the City of London police into the investigation, which until then had been handled by the Metropolitan Police. The killer, free from interruption this time, had inflicted terrible injuries. Not only was her throat cut, but her face was disfigured, and her abdomen was opened. Her left kidney and a major part of her uterus had been removed and taken. It was a scene of unparalleled brutality. A piece of a blood-stained apron was later found in a nearby doorway, and above it, a chalk inscription on the wall. This graffiti, which read the Jews, "Are the men that will not be blamed for nothing," was washed away by police before it could be photographed, fearing it would spark anti-Semitic riots. This Goulston Street graffito remains one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the entire case. The final canonical murder, and the most savage of all, occurred over a month later on November 9th. The victim was Mary Jane Kelly. At just 25 years old, she was much younger than the other victims. She was also different in another way. Unlike the others who were killed outdoors, Mary was murdered in her own room at 30 Miller's Court, a small, sparsely furnished room off Dorset Street. Mary was described as attractive, with blonde hair and blue eyes, and had a more stable living situation than the other women. But on that morning, her landlord sent his assistant to collect overdue rent. When he couldn't get a response, he peered through a broken window pane. What he saw was a scene of absolute carnage. The police who broke down the door were met with a sight so horrific it was barely recognizable as a human body. Mary Kelly had been completely invisible. Her organs were placed around the room. Parts of her flesh were stripped from her bones, and her heart had been taken from the crime scene. The killer had worked for hours, undisturbed, in the privacy of her room. This was the ghastly climax of the Ripper's killing spree. After the murder of Mary Kelly, the killings suddenly stopped, and so the reign of terror in Whitechapel came to an end. But the legend was just beginning. The 5 women, Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Mary Jane, were not just names on a list. They were mothers, daughters, and wives. They were women trying to survive in one of London's poorest districts, whose circumstances made them vulnerable to a predator who stalked the dark, foggy streets. While the identity of Jack the Ripper remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries, it's crucial that we remember the real people at the heart of this dark chapter. Ever heard of a killer who taunted the police with letters? That's exactly what happened during the reign of terror of Jack the Ripper. Today, we are rediving into one of the most chilling aspects of this unsolved mystery: the infamous letters from hell. These weren't just letters. They were pieces of a puzzle that turned a local crime spree into a global media phenomenon. It all started in the autumn of 1888, in the dark, foggy streets of Whitechapel, London. A series of brutal murders had the city on edge. The victims were all women from the impoverished East End, and the killer was swift, silent, and seemingly invisible. The police, led by Scotland Yard, were completely stumped. They had no leads, no witnesses, and no idea who they were hunting. The public was terrified, and the press was having a field day, publishing sensational stories that fueled the growing panic. Then, something happened that changed everything. A letter arrived at the Central News Agency, dated September 25th. It began with the chillingly casual phrase, "Dear Boss." The author claimed to be the murderer. He mocked the police for their incompetence, calling them clod-hopping cops and boasting that they would never catch him. He even promised to clip the lady's ears off in his next job. The letter was written in red ink, and it was filled with a mix of arrogance and playful menace. The most significant part, it was signed with a name that would soon become infamous worldwide: Jack the Ripper. At first, the police and the press dismissed it as a cruel prank. Hoax letters were common during high-profile cases, but just a few days later, on September 30th, the killer struck again in what became known as the double event. 2 women, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, were murdered in the same night, and part of Catherine Eddowes' ear had been severed. The promise from the Dear Boss letter had been fulfilled. Suddenly, the letter wasn't a joke anymore. It was a direct communication from the killer himself. The police, desperate for any lead, decided to publicize the letter, hoping someone might recognize the handwriting. This was a massive gamble, and it backfired spectacularly. Instead of helping the investigation, publishing the letter unleashed a tidal wave of copycats. Hundreds, and then thousands, of letters poured into police stations and newspaper offices, all claiming to be from Jack the Ripper. It was a logistical nightmare. The police had to waste precious time and resources sifting through this mountain of mail, trying to separate the genuine from the fake. The public, already gripped by fear, became obsessed. The name Jack the Ripper was on everyone's lips. He was no longer just a murderer. He was a character, a bogeyman created by his own hand. Just a day after the double event, another piece of mail arrived, this time a postcard. It was also addressed to the Central News Agency and again written in what appeared to be red ink, possibly blood. It was nicknamed the Saucy Jackie postcard because the writer referred to himself as Saucy Jackie. He mentioned the double event, saying he didn't have time to get the ears for police. This seemed to confirm it was from the same person as the Dear Boss letter. The public frenzy reached a fever pitch. The Ripper wasn't just killing, he was playing a game with the entire city. But the most horrifying piece of this puzzle was yet to come. On October 16th, George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a group of local citizens who had banded together to patrol the streets, received a small package. When he opened it, he found a handwritten letter and tuis, horror, half of a human kidney preserved in alcohol. The letter began with the terrifying words, "From hell." The writer claimed he had fried and eaten the other half of the kidney, saying it was very nice. He ended the letter with a taunt, "Catch me when you can." This From Hell letter was different. The handwriting, the tone, the spelling it was all cruder, more ABC. It lacked the playful arrogance of the Dear Boss letter. Tees felt raw and genuinely malevolent. The kidney was examined by a doctor who confirmed it was a human kidney, likely from a woman who suffered from Bright's disease, a condition one of the victims, Catherine Edowis, was known to have had. This was the most compelling evidence that the police were actually in contact with the killer. It was terrifying proof that he was not just a phantom but a real person who was dissecting his victims and sending trophies. These letters completely transformed the investigation and the public's perception of the killer. Before the letters, he was an anonymous monster. After the letters, Eade, a name, a personality, and a voice. The media ran with it. Newspapers across the globe reprinted the letters, and Jack the Ripper became the world's first celebrity serial killer. He was a legend, a folk devil, born from a perfect storm of police failure, media sensationalism, and his own twisted need for recognition. But here is the big question that still haunts historians and criminologists today. Were any of these letters actually written by the killer? The Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard are now widely believed to be a hoax, written by a journalist to keep the story in the headlines and sell more newspapers. In fact, years later, a journalist named Fred Best allegedly confessed to writing them. If Thesis True, it means a reporter, not the killer, created the name Jack the Ripper. Think about that for a second. The entire legend, the name that echoes through history, might have been a journalistic fabrication. The From Hell letter, however, is a different story. Many experts believe it is the only one that was likely genuine. The specific detail of the kidney, a detail not released to the public, makes it incredibly hard to dismiss as a hoax. It suggests the author had intimate knowledge of the crimes, so we're left with this strange paradox. The name that made the killer famous was probably a fake, but the most gruesome letter of all was probably real. The failure of the police to catch the Ripper can be partly blamed on this media circus. They were overwhelmed, chasing shadows created by the press and the hundreds of hoax letters. The real killer, whoever he was, managed to slip away, his identity forever lost to history. The letters, whether real or fake, served their purpose. They created chaos, distracted the police, and cemented the killer's place in the dark corners of our imagination. For over a century, the name Jack the Ripper has echoed through the grimy gaslit alleys of Victorian London, a phantom figure synonymous with terror and mystery. 5 women, all struggling to survive in the impoverished Whitechapel district, met a gruesome end in the autumn of 1888. But the man behind the shadow, the killer who signed his letters from hell, was never caught. His identity remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. But that doesn't mean we're short on suspects. In fact, the list is long and shockingly diverse, stretching from the slums of the East End all the way to the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace. Let's delve into the darkness and examine the most compelling, the most bizarre, and the most enduring theories about who Jack the Ripper really was. The most common theory, both then and now, is that the Ripper had to be a doctor or someone with anatomical knowledge. The surgical precision with which the victims were mutilated suggested a skilled hand, someone familiar with human anatomy. This led investigators to look at the medical community. One of the earliest suspects was Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher, who was found drowned in the Thames shortly after the final murder. This elaborate story, popularized in books and films, suggests the murders were an inside job, a chilling cover-up orchestrated by the highest echelons of society. The tale goes that Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson and second in line to the throne, had secretly married and had a child with a common Catholic girl from Whitechapel. To prevent a royal scandal of epic proportions, the establishment, led by Sir William Goole, supposedly silenced anyone who knew the secret, starting with the mother's friends. It's a sensational, Hollywood-worthy plot, but most historians today dismiss it as pure fiction, a conspiracy theory woven from rumors and lacking any concrete proof. The prince himself had solid alibis for the times of the murders, and Goole was in his 70s and had recently suffered a stroke. It seems highly unlikely he could have been prowling the streets of Whitechapel, committing these brutal acts. But the list of medical men doesn't end there. There was the American quack, Francis Tumbled, a flamboyant herbalist, who was known for his collection of anatomical specimensky, uteri, in jars. He was arrested in London during the murder spree on a minor charge, but fled the country back to the United States. Before he could be questioned further, Scotland Yard even sent an inspector to America to track him down, suggesting they took him very seriously. But again, a lack of direct evidence means he remains just another tantalizing possibility. Another name that often comes up is Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, the Lambeth poisoner. He was a convicted murderer who, as he stood on the gallows for his other crimes, supposedly uttered the words, "I am Jack, the ... before the trapdoor fell." A dramatic confession, perhaps. The problem is, Dr. Cream was in prison in Illinois during the entire Ripper murder spree. A pretty solid alibi, you'd have to agree. Leaving the medical field, we enter the world of art. Walter Sickert, a renowned British painter, became a prime suspect thanks to the work of crime novelist Patricia Cornwell. She spent millions of dollars on her investigation, arguing that Sickert's paintings contained hidden clues and macabre imagery that mirrored the crime scenes. She even purchased some of his paintings and letters, testing them for DNA. Her theory is that Sickert was not only the Ripper but also responsible for other murders. She points to his dark, atmospheric paintings of London's underbelly and claims he was psychologically capable of such acts. However, the art world and most Ripperologists remain unconvinced. They argue that Sickert was simply painting the gritty reality of his time and that the DNA evidence Cornwell presented was inconclusive and could have been the result of contamination over the decades. He was a Polish-Jewish immigrant who worked as a hairdresser in Whitechapel. He suffered from severe mental illness, had a profound hatred of women, and was known to have homicidal tendencies. His theory was that the one witness who got a good look at the killer was also Jewish and refused to testify against a fellow Jew. The Kosminski theory gained massive traction in 2014 when a shawl, supposedly found next to the body of victim Catherine Eddowes, was analyzed for DNA. The debate rages on, and the DNA evidence remains highly controversial. He was another Polish immigrant who was a convicted serial killer, poisoning 3 of his wives. Proponents of this theory claim to have found anagrams in his writing that confess to the crimes. Needless to say, this is considered by virtually everyone to be a fringe conspiracy, with no basis in reality. So, after sifting through doctors, royals, artists, and immigrants, where does that leave us? We have a collection of circumstantial evidence, tantalizing coincidences, and questionable scientific findings. We have police reports, eyewitness accounts that contradicted each other, and a mountain of speculation. Each suspect has points in their favor, and points that make their involvement seem impossible. Perhaps the Ripper was none of these named individuals. Perhaps he was just a local lunatic, a violent nobody whose name was never even considered by police, who died or stopped killing for reasons we'll never know. This is perhaps the most likely and most frustrating conclusion. The man we call Jack the Ripper was a ghost. He emerged from the fog of Victorian London, created a legend written in blood, and then vanished back into the shadows, leaving us with nothing but a name and an eternal, unsolvable question. The search for his identity has become a cultural obsession, a dark puzzle that continues to fascinate and horrify us more than a century later. See you next time.